Good afternoon and welcome to an EAS webinar, a look at Fisma and FDA priorities through FDA Form 83s and warning letters. EAS is a member of a certified group of companies and is a leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA. Our global network of over 150 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. Today's presenter is Brian Armentrout, and Brian is a food safety expert with expertise in quality systems development, SQF, HACCP, design control, auditing, recalls, and crisis management, as well as process improvement. Prior to consulting, he was a vice president of quality assurance and food safety with Boulder Brands and the vice president of quality assurance and food safety at CSC Sugar LLC. He has a history of benchmark success leading companies to more efficient and compliant processes. Different today than other webinars, because of the size of the slide files, we were not able to email them in advance. So once we post the webinar to the website, we'll certainly include a link to download those slide handouts, but unfortunately I just wasn't able to provide them to you today. During the webinar, however, you'll be able to ask any questions of Brian by typing them into the questions box, and we will save all questions for the end. With that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and we'll turn the presentation over to Brian.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. And thank you to EAS Consulting, a wonderful consulting company who does some really great things out there. Some really amazing people that I work with on this team. So definitely, if you have anything out there that you need work on, reach out to EAS. And of course, at the end, we'll have contact information and all that good stuff. But today's webinar is going to be a really interesting one, everybody. And so thank you for attending this webinar. A ton of information that we're going to be diving into relative to this. So time is limited, so I'm going to get right to it. So first off, with this, this picture for me here, as Amy kind of alluded to, who am I and what are the different things that I've done? So here you can see some of the things associated with me. Worked in the food industry over 25 years, running quality assurance at large CPG companies. Started a consulting business here a few years ago and been doing some things in that space. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The New Manager Mindset, which allows people to kind of transition from that individual contributor to a management role. And some of the hard lessons I learned along the way. So hopefully that'll help people avoid some of the mistakes I made. In addition to that, I have the Food Safety Foundation, which is a collaborative website where people get together and help each other with food safety, something that here in the age of COVID, we see all the time because we don't have that direct interaction with people outside of our direct circle. So really excited about that, and that is really going well. So with this then is the agenda, right? So how are we going to be going through this information today? And if you are an analytical person and you love data like I do, you're going to love this presentation. Now with this, here's our different agenda items here. And so kind of from a 30,000 foot level, and you'll hear me talk about this at different points in the presentation, guys, is we're going to dive down into the detail and then we're going to come back up for air. And data is not really very valuable unless you can figure out what it is that you do with that data. So that's very important to keep in mind here. So as you're taking notes and you're looking at the different things associated with this presentation, write those things down so that you can figure out what it is that you need to do as next steps associated with the presentation. Now, one of the things, and people fight me on this all the time, and it's 100% true. I'm sorry it is, but it's true. Multitasking does not work. Research has shown this time and time again that you become less efficient and you get less information into your head if you're trying to focus on multiple things at the same time. So you've made a choice here today to join me for this webinar and learn some of this information I put together for you. Your time is valuable, so extract as much as you can from this information. So turn off Facebook, right? It's really easy in this age of sitting in front of our computers at home, right? Turn off Facebook, kick the cat out of the room, close the door, take tons of notes, write down those questions like Amy said, write down those questions for the end. I will stay around as long as there are questions. As long as you guys have questions, I will answer those, right? So let's dive in. So what is our objective today? And really, this is getting back to understanding the data. right? And this breaks down into kind of three main areas, right? So 483 citations. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain a little bit more on that when we get into it. Warning letters from FDA. And then, of course, what nobody wants, right, is recalls. You need to then take this information, use this to evaluate your programs and put together an action plan to improve things associated with this. FDA puts out incredible amounts of data on their websites, and all the data I'm using in this presentation is directly from FDA. Now, within this, there's some data that they don't go far enough in evaluating this. So I actually went through the data that we're looking at today for 2020, and I assigned categories to different elements. So for example, in micro, I broke it down then into, is it a Listeria issue? Was it a Salmonella issue? By actually reading the information from FDA to then put that in there and filter this data. So that's what this is pulling out of this. So if you go and get this information directly from FDA, that's going to be missing that information. So hopefully here, this will provide some extra value for you in understanding this data. So let's kind of take a look now at a couple of definitions, right? So if you're working in an FDA regulated industry, and FDA comes to inspect, and as we know now, FDA sends investigators when they go to your facilities. And they look at different things, and they have two different levels of audits. And we'll talk about this here a little bit later as well. So hang around for that. If FDA find things in their facility that they aren't too happy about, they're going to list it on this form. And this is called an Inspectional Observation Form 483. And then down in the corner there, that's the form number that FDA has for this. Everybody just calls it 483. And on this form, then FDA lists out things that they weren't happy with during the visit. You then have 15 days back to respond. Now, FDA has a GMP audit and then a Fisma, Food Safety Modernization Act, focused audit, right? So depending upon why they're at your facility, they're going to have different levels of audit. So they just may be coming in to do a basic visit of your facility, check things out, look on the floor, are people washing their hands, that type of thing. That's a first level audit. The second level audit then is more food safety focused. And then those type of situations there, they're probably there for cause. They're there because they have identified a risk associated with your product, or they're gathering information. And that'll link in with what we're going to be talking about later as well. Important piece here, the redactions you see on this 483 are not from FDA. We put those there to protect the integrity of the person that I pulled this off of. But I got this off of the web, and you can too. So always remember within this information under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, anybody can go out and make a request of FDA and get this information. It's like opening the doors to your plant. Everything that is on this form, anybody can read. And it's always very important to remember that FDA is using this to gather information as well as expecting corrective actions back from you. And this goes into your file, right? So in red there, what I circled there was a conversation with the quality department. They're saying, oh yeah, we were looking at this and we had some problems with that and these type of activities relative to this produce product. A 483 is an evidence gathering tool, and you have to respond back within 15 days. It has to be taken very seriously, and your organization needs to be set up in advance to respond to that information. The next tier above a 483 then, guys, of course, is a warning letter. This goes to the senior person responsible for food safety in the company. That's not the operations guy. That's not the quality guy. It's the CEO. And we have blocked out his name on this warning letter that's circled here. Ultimately, under the PARC doctrine, that person is responsible, and there's laws in place going back to 1978. Look the case up online. And that person can be held personally liable for food safety issues. So this letter then is establishing the legal language, citing the failure. Again, right, this is evidence gathering, corrective actions that are required, and FDA follow-up and other actions that may take place. They may have to come back and audit your facilities again to see what's going on. And if that's the case under FSMA, you're paying for that. So again, warning letters are public information. They are FOIA information, and anybody can get these at any time. Not something you want for your company. So one of the things with recalls that people sometimes confuse is the classifications of recalls. And these definitions that I pulled here are the verbatim definitions from FDA. And somebody asked me recently and said, well, how do I decide what class of recall? And the answer is you don't. FDA decides for you what classification of recall is based upon the information that you provide and the circumstances of that. And I came across some really surprising information relative to Listeria that I'm going to be showing you a little later. So what I put here in red is the meat of what each of these is saying. All right, so class 1 recall, there's a reasonable probability of adverse health consequences or death, right? This is a serious thing, class 1 recall. Class 2, there may be temporary things. People may get sick and then they're going to get better. But the chances of a generally healthy person succumbing to whatever this is are pretty small. And a class 3 recall is kind of like the catch-all bucket associated with something that needs to be reported under the recall system and the reportable foods registry, and it's not likely to cause a health consequence. So what's our methodology here for going through this data here today? We've just kind of gone through it at a high level. So we're going to be looking at 483 inspectional observations. And what are some of the top causes? What did the FDA cite? Whenever I can within this information, I'm trying to keep this to the top 5 or top 10 to give some clarity around this. Of course, there's a lot more detail out in the tail associated with this data. What are the leading causes of warning letters and recalls? And then using this, right, this is important, so pay attention to this piece, right, is use this information on the recalls for Fisma-based analysis. Because if you've been paying attention and you are involved with FDA's rules associated with enhanced traceability, this is the type of data that FDA is using to evaluate and decide what went on that list for high risk products under the enhanced traceability proposed rules that they're working on. So with this data, use the 80-20 rule, right? The goal here is not to memorize everything. And I'm talking to a wide audience with all kinds of different products and all kinds of different things going on. So you need to laser in on those things that are important for your business and make note of those. So with that, let's dive in. So again, this data is for 2020, right? Everything that you're seeing here is for 2020 only, not current or the prior year. So with that, FDA's business year does not correspond to the calendar year, right? So January through December of 2020 is not FDA's calendar. They go Q4 19 through Q3 20. So the data ends in September for 2020, right? So if you see discrepancies between data, if you look at it that way, that's why that occurs. Now, something here, guys, should jump out big time, right? Look at foreign supplier verification. Goodness, crazy, right? And FDA has been talking about this. And Sharon Mayle at FDA has been speaking at conferences and talking about foreign supplier verification and telling people, hey, guys, you've got to get ready for this. We're going to start inspecting 2 foreign supplier verification. We'll be ramping up that activity. You need to be ready for this, right? Obviously here now, FDA is showing that, man, they're writing a lot of 483 inspectional observations relative to foreign supplier verification. So you've got 514, right? That's almost 5x the next nearest 483 inspectional observation citation. Hazard identification, right? And then those all kind of even out at that point. So hazard identification, pest control, operational conditions, personnel practices, all 4 of these categories, well, 3 of the 4. Hazard identification is tied to your food safety plan. And the other 3, pest, operational, and personnel practices, are tied to GMP audits within FDA. And you'll often see this on 483s with FDA. There'll be a section associated to your food safety plan. And there'll be a section associated with observational information associated with your good manufacturing practices. So that's the big ones, right? So something clearly stated here, right? And we'll talk about this a little later. Button up that foreign supplier verification. So from those top 5, here's the verbiage that FDA associated with this as a category. So the little dots at the end is what this means is that FDA for that category started off with this language and then dived into the specifics for those different 500 or so people who got cited for that. You did not develop a foreign supplier program, right? So FDA went in and they didn't even have a program. Didn't even have a program. Your hazard analysis, the next point on the list, did not identify a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard that required a preventive control. So if you don't know about Appendix 1, do a Google search on that, FDA Appendix 1. FDA has put together a guidance document which lists out the chemical, physical, and microbiological hazards that they consider relevant and that you should be considering. Keep in mind, too, that the data we're going over today is perfect for including in your hazard analysis. Next point, you did not, and then we're talking about pests, right? Protect against contamination. So FDA was in the plant and saw observational activities relative to your pest control programs. You did not conduct operations under conditions and controls necessary to minimize potential for X. And you didn't take reasonable measure and precaution related to personnel practices, GMP type things. So I want everybody to kind of pay attention to a word that is showing up in this multiple times. You did not develop. You did not conduct, right? It doesn't say the company did not conduct. It says you did not conduct. So 483, prevention. It's hard to say prevention now that we've gotten used to saying preventative, isn't it? So your 483 prevention action plan, audit like FDA. Think in terms of GMP audits and think in terms of Fisma audits. And if you didn't know this, FDA's inspection guidebook, what they use for inspections, is available on the web. And you can look that up and get insights into how FDA conducts themselves when they're doing an investigation and inspection in your facility. But you need to look at your program and say, all right, I need to look at this like FDA looks at it. You definitely need to dig deep into your foreign supplier verification program. And there's lots of moving parts. Fsvp is not part of 117. It's 1.5. And people miss that, right? You need to go and read the regs around that and what is required and figure out within your company who's taking care of for the foreign suppliers, who is the registered agent, who is taking care of the registration in the CBP program. What DUNS number are you using? Is there anybody out there who is also using your DUNS number? Because there has been quite a bit of fraud around that. What are the locations of the product? Who owns it at entry? These type of activities. Who in your company is managing those? Because if FDA goes in the database, looks up a product and wants to go inspect that at the stated location, and there's nothing there, they're not going to be happy. Dig into your FSVP. Revisit your hazard analysis, right? We talked about Appendix 1. And use the data in this presentation to overlay and add to your hazard analysis. Remember, it's always best to use FDA's own data and the government's own data for your hazard analysis, right? You're talking the same language with the government and the regulatory authorities for this process so that you understand what it is that they consider important and you're considering important as well. Now, everybody is different, right? And if you have something different, you need to be able to justify that and understand it. So warning letters. So this goes back to the warning letter earlier that was redacted, right? And so in those warning letters, FDA then speaks in legalese. It's the best way to put it. And when you read through this, you're like, wow, right? And FDA is setting the groundwork. They're saying, according to these sections of this law in this act, your product is deleterious for adulteration, misbranding, these type of activities. And FDA is essentially saying in this warning letter, you have violated the law. And that's why it goes to the person most responsible for food safety within your company. So in 2020, here are the leading causes of warning letters. Adulterated product. Next up, FSVP, right? And as we saw earlier, FSVP, they went in to check these, and the most common comment was they didn't even have a program. So FDA is escalating this up to a warning letter in serious cases. Labeling, I find that one's kind of interesting as well. So warning letters to the point where labeling has risen to that level of control. And they've also specifically called out Listeria monocytogenes down here in 5, and then an actual GMP violation that warranted a warning letter. So with warning letters, what's the action plan? Of course, this gentleman here in the picture is Bill Marler of Marler and Clark in Seattle. This is one of the leading attorneys out there that if you get a warning letter and there's a class action, he's going to be the guy suing you, right? The bottom line with a warning letter is don't get one, right? It shouldn't get to that point. But if it does, make sure you have the legal food resources ready to go and help the company respond. You've got a very short limited period of time, right? 15 business days to get a response back. And that response, again, is public. Now, companies of a certain size, smaller companies may not, but larger companies, right? They have in-house counsel and things like this. And you may be saying to yourself, oh, I'm okay, Brian. We've got lawyers here in-house at our company. We're good. No, you're probably not. The lawyers you have in company are specialized in different areas, right? They're looking at mergers and acquisitions. They're looking at contract law. They're looking at employee relations. They're looking at all of these type of activities associated with running a public business, all of these things, not legal food. You need to have outside counsel who specialize in food law and understand everything that we're talking about here today so that they can represent you with FDA and CIFSAN and these other organizations with a food law background. There's some really good organizations out there. So something you need to communicate in your organization is once that warning letter has been written, the damage is done, right? Fix it, make sure it doesn't happen again, put the resources in place and get everything back on track. Because one thing is guaranteed, that's going in your file and FDA will be back. Right? They're going to follow up on this and make sure you did what you say that you did. So the actual recall data, right? So we're kind of moving down the pyramid. Things are getting, larger and larger, right? And there's a lot of data associated with this. Data that's actionable, right? Data, again, right? I keep pounding this point home. Data that you don't use and execute is just data, right? You need to make it actionable. Figure out what you need. So put the rubber to the road, just like this nice Porsche, and let's dive into the data. So what I've done with this is organize this by classes. And something to keep in mind here for this data is we're going to do deep dives and then we'll come back up for error and look for lessons. Then we'll go down and we'll deep dive again and we'll come back up for error. So as we do that, keep that in mind. So if you're getting bogged down in the detail, don't worry, we'll come back to a 30,000 foot view again. So in the 2020 FDA calendar year, they had 1,277 total recalls. And I find this very interesting is that class 1 was 40%, but 54% was class 2, right? So going back to our definitions, class 1, likely to cause serious injury or harm. Class 2, it's going to cause an illness, but you'll be fine. And class 3, everything else, right? So more class 2 than class 1. So what are those recalls by type? And this is what's interesting with this data when you look at it, and something that you need to take into consideration as you look at these things. FDA as a category puts food and cosmetics together as a group when they report out the data, right? It's because of their reporting structure and how they manage things. So when you see things pop up in here that don't necessarily apply directly to food, that's why. And you're seeing it here on this recall category by type. So micro leading the way at 431 recalls by category type. Allergens, about half of that. Foreign material, look at foreign material. And then we've got chemical down here. And then you've got this outlier, this company, Sundial Herbal Products. And that's why this legal category is here. This normally wouldn't be here. FDA actually issued a federal injunction against this company because of labeling claims and all kinds of assertions they were making in their products. They made them recall all products from the market. Everything that they manufactured back to the beginning, I think it was around 2006, everything had to be removed from the market. And as you can imagine, this company then went out of business, right? So they had absolutely no understanding of regulatory processes. So we're going to look at recalls by Fisma categorization. This is the best way to look at it. So micro, chemical, and of course, within the chemical, allergen, a huge group, and then physical. And again, if this point hasn't hit home yet, use this data for your products. So class 1 micro recalls. Salmonella leading the way at 238. And of those, the biggest ones were recalls for onions. You guys may remember that in the news. It was all over the place. peaches. Listeria was the next. And the majority of those, and keeping in mind here, right, I'm talking in generalizations of what were the things I found in those categories that popped out as the largest contributor, right? That's where these comments are coming from. And for these Listeria class 1 micro recalls, this was very interesting. A large chunk of those was for environmental matches. So FDA went in, did an inspection. Let's say they did a swabathon. They were able to match Listeria in the environment to cases that they had in their databases. And the company issued a recall based on that data, right? So CIFSAN is collecting a giant database associated with environmental sampling and E. coli in sprouts. And notice here on these class 1s, right? Onions, peaches, sprouts, produce, right? We're seeing produce show up heavily in the enhanced traceability high-risk products with FDA and their proposal. Class 2, here's where that big cyclospora recall came back in with that ready-to-eat salad, knocking it to the top of the list here with 95, by far the biggest category associated with this. This was a big recall. And again, this is 2, so you're expected to get better. But if you've had a parasitic cyclospora event, not a pretty thing. You'll see here again, Listeria, right? Isn't that interesting? You would think that Listeria is always going to be a class 1, but that's not the case. It depends on the circumstances, right? And working this through with FDA to figure this out. So here we have a combination of Listeria, and there was a lot associated with ingredients and environmental results as well. Here we have the Salmonella trickling down into the onions, and then spoilage, right? We're seeing where 10 recalls were issued for class 2 for companies that had issues with spoilage and mold in their products. Class 3, this one, look at this, Listeria in retail raw chicken cutlets. And there was 10 recalls associated with a retailer on this issue. I found this fascinating to actually see that there was a class 3 recall for Listeria, and that this product, of course, then would be cooked by the consumer or these types of things like that. But FDA looked at all the evidence associated with this and decided to issue a class 3 recall on this. Amazing. Chemical, right? So physical, chemical, microbiological. So for chemical, class 1 undeclared sulfites in a product. So FDA looked at this particular case, and there were 2 recalls for this. And so those sulfites were at a level high enough to be injurious to health with people who had a condition associated with sulfite sensitivity and things of this nature. This was pretty serious, whatever this was, right? And I looked at the detail in here, and it was pretty hard to tell. But man, this was a very interesting class 1 recall for chemicals. Class 2, and now it gets a little broader. And you're starting to see histamine, right? So fish that have this histamine and cause people to be sick. Herbicides, so organic products that had herbicides, and other products that had herbicides detected in those products that shouldn't be there. Here then we see undeclared sulfites. And now we're getting into the cosmetic side of things too. So we have Colt's foot, which was put in a product that was for internal use and shouldn't have been there. And detection of an antibiotic. 3 cases associated with that. Very interesting. Class 3. So here we are again with our pesticides and herbicides, right? And our sulfites, unapproved colors. We've got some antibiotics and nightshade. What? Nightshade, look at that. So we had a recall for nightshade in frozen peas. So they probably harvested this and got some nightshade in those frozen peas that was growing there. Craziness. So back up to the 30,000 foot level, guys. For chemical, as we look through this, what were the lessons that we've learned for this? So concentration is highly important for classification, right? We had the class 1 recall for Listeria, and class 2 was the vast majority of things, right? So they looked at the concentrations from an epidemiological standpoint and said, what are the chances of illness in the general population, et cetera? And FDA then classified things accordingly. So they were looking for ingredient contamination as well, right? And so we definitely saw that on the undeclared herbicides and things of this nature in the product, but also what's not there. What's not there is the radiological, right? Which is part of your hazard analysis. But as I went through all of the data, no recalls for radiological. So good news. All right, so let's get into this other category with chemical allergens. Whoa, lots of information with allergens, right? And I have written on here, sesame's coming. That's here, right? So President Biden has signed that, right? So this is going to be expected, right? This is going to be rolled in 2022, I believe, is when that's really the rubber hits the road associated with that. So with this, here's kind of the overall hierarchy of allergens for class 1, so serious illness associated cases. Milk, number 1, egg, tree nuts, so almonds, cashews, those type of things, peanut, and then wheat. And a big chunk of this was undeclared allergens. So there was a big mistake that took place where either the label was written incorrectly or the wrong label was put on the wrong product or things of this nature. Undeclared allergens, class 1, huge. Class 2, same thing. But now here, you notice you didn't see it in 1. Soy was not in 1. Soy is showing up as number 1 here. And a lot of these were tied to people not realizing that if they were using oils or things of this nature, that they may have undeclared allergens in there. A lot of the wheat ones here, gluten labeling. From what I saw, a lot of companies who had gluten-free products didn't realize that they had wheat in those products and that triggered a class 2 recall. Milk, tree nuts, now we're seeing fish, undeclared fish showing up in products. And class 3, labeling again, right? So in this particular case, and I'm sure FDA looked at these very closely on a case-by-case basis to look at risk, right? But the same thing you're seeing, soy labeling, peanuts, milk, and wheat associated with these products. So what's the 30,000 foot lesson here from allergens is it's super clear, right? You cannot put in a strong enough label check system within your processes. You have to put in an absolutely bulletproof allergen system in your process. As a matter of fact, earlier this week, late last week, an allergen alert came out for an undeclared allergen in a snack food. This is a major snack food company here in the US. This was their 6th recall in less than 2 years for undeclared allergens. So it happens to big companies as well as small companies, right? You need to be checking those allergens on your labels with your suppliers. You need to be making sure that what you're bringing in hasn't changed and is correct when you bring those in at receipt, while you're using them in process, that you're not getting rework and other things that may be cross-contaminating and messing with your allergen program, sanitation, all these type of things, and of course, shipping. So really for your entire process of receiving, processing, packaging, shipping in any production facility, those allergen labels need to be checked time and time and time again. You need to be 100% sure that your allergen program is tight. And FDA is looking at allergen labeling really, really closely. So let's dive back down and look at physical. So class 1 for physical, choking hazard. And this was a no-brainer for FDA. This was a importation of a candy for children. It's these large gelatin candies that come from the Asian market. And it's really, really easy for a kid to accidentally try and swallow that whole thing, and it's too big for their throat, and bam, it's stuck. And it adheres to the walls of the esophagus, and it doesn't move, and that child suffocates. There were 3 issues where these products were coming into the US, right? So FDA, if they see these type of things, immediately they're going to issue a class 1 recall on those. Class 2, this is interesting, right? So we're always in production facilities focused on metal contamination. And what I found with this is, yes, it's number 1, but look at the other ones, right? And with metal, ingredient contamination, right? Things coming into your plant that have metal shavings or things like this, where your supplier recalled it and then you got caught up in it, was huge. A huge percentage of that 48. But look at this: rubber, plastic, glass. And this one was interesting, unknown. We have 23 cases of unknown physical class 2 recalls. And through the data, and I went back and looked at the actual recall notifications and things like this, the companies didn't know what it was. They couldn't identify it. Now, metal detection and X-ray are the 2 main points of looking for these type of things. X-ray, as we all know, can be a very challenging tool to use, because if you don't have the right density gradient associated with those products, it's not going to pick it up. And if you're making a dairy product or things like this, rubber versus cheese or plastic versus cheese, right? Very, very close together. So you need to take a close look at this and what type of pre-op and post-op inspection programs do you have in place to make sure that the rubber, plastic, glass, other type of things that have the potential for getting into product are taken care of, right? Detection equipment may not be enough. My advice here at this point, based on this data, is you need to really take a hard look at your physical detection methodologies. In class 3, this one cracks me up. So there was one recall for physical for a class 3 with a aseptic hand soap that had particles. Right? Oh, okay, really? I'm not quite sure why that even showed up, but I think it's kind of funny. So let's jump up, guys, back to the 30,000 foot level. And let's look at recall classes overall, and then recall categories overall. So class 1, things that can potentially make people very sick or kill them. What are the things that the FDA found the most? Micro and allergens were the two highest, right? So Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli, and milk and egg allergens, the two highest for class 1. Class 2, foreign material, gluten-free, right? A big chunk of what's showing up in that gluten-free. Now, of course, over there, you see the cyclosporia, which was kind of a one-off, but also don't forget Listeria over there, right? But if you're looking at Listeria, and that's why I didn't include it here on this graph, you should always consider Listeria as a class 1 type threat to address. In class 3, chemical contaminants, herbicides, these type of things, right? You need to really be looking at chemical contaminants for your class 3 activities. So for micro threats, what are the biggest things? So Salmonella, Listeria, the big cyclospora recall, which normally doesn't show up, shows up here now because of that issue. E. coli and mold, right? 28 mold recalls. Top allergen, milk. And FDA has a program in place and they're looking at this and they are actively sampling. This is in their 2021 training manual for inspections in the field, is that is one of the reasons that they can come into your facility now. So there is for cause, you have an issue and they're investigating it. There's a routine inspection, but FDA is also now going out and doing allergen surveys. And in particular, they're looking at milk, right? They are looking at this data just like we're looking at this data and saying, we need to get the number of milk recalls down. Let's do an investigation as to why, right? But the other ones aren't that far behind. Foreign material, right? Metal, again, leading the way. But overall, class 1, 2, 3, when you roll all these up, unknown, number 2, rubber, plastic, glass, right? Metal detector is only going to pick up one of those 5 things on that list. Chemical, herbicides, histamines in the fish, right? Sulfites, another chemical down there as well. So the big question then is, and what you need to think about and take away from this presentation is, how does this data impact your food safety plan? How can you now take this and roll this back into your hazard analysis and get together in your companies with your food safety teams? What preventive controls do you have in place? So if metal is coming in suppliers, what are we doing to either audit or do random checks or some type of a program associated with that within our preventive controls for supply chain? Our prerequisite programs, how can we beef up our GMPs? What can we do to make sure that the pest control program is working adequately? What can we do to make sure, how can we increase our awareness of those prerequisites? Sanitation verification, right? Everybody knows this, huge, huge for allergens. Any plant that has allergens or has allergen changeovers, looking at that sanitation verification program, how do you know that works? Environmental monitoring, right? This is very, very important. FDA, when they're going in, they're focusing on zone 1 and zone 2. They may look at zone 3, not a whole lot of zone 4, right? Pretty much opposite the way in industry we've been looking at this. You need to look really closely at your environmental program. And again, allergen control, right? Clearly pull out of this data here. So your action plan, review this data. Don't keep it to yourself. Make sure the organization understands this, right? And that's where bringing this back up to the 30,000 foot level helps, because it explains to people who aren't necessarily analytical what they need to be worried about. Go back to your food safety plans. Train the organization in these new rules. and execute. But also, guys, remember, you're not alone on this. And I think that's one of the things in quality and food safety that we tend to do is we want to take on the world by ourselves, but that's very inefficient and it doesn't always work that way, right? So make sure that you're using all the resources at your disposal and working with others, right? Because food safety is not a point of competition. We're all in this together. So resources for this, right? Your food safety data file, using this for the compliance and all these things that FDA has, and taking and putting these tables into pivot tables and analyzing this data in different ways, which is what I did. And of course, working with EAS consulting group and using their huge 150 plus people out there who understand these type of subjects and can help you accelerate your process and take this information to the next level. So thanks everybody for your attention. I really appreciate it. I know that webinars sometimes there's a lot to get through, and especially when it's an analytical one like this. And we have a huge number of people who attended through the entire presentation. And I really appreciate that. So thank you. And we're going to switch it back over to Amy now, and we'll take questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. Fantastic presentation. I see a couple people have asked about PowerPoint slides, and we mentioned it before the start, but the size of the file prohibited us from emailing it, even in a PDF handout. So we will post a link to it once we are able to get the recording of this up on the website. So let's get right on to questions. The first question is, why won't FDA classify recalls?
Oh, maybe I miscommunicated that. FDA is the group that classifies recalls. So when there's a situation and you go into the reportable food registry, FDA then takes that data. You have regional offices around the country by district. The correct one who has ownership for the facility where that RFR was listed will then begin communicating with the production facility. Of course, and investigators go out and these type of things. FDA classifies the recall, and they'll use the 1, 2, 3 methodology that we just showed you, which is why Listeria shows up in 1, 2, and 3, because FDA went in and looked and said, okay, here's where is the correct risk assessment associated with this recall.
Great, thank you. The next question is why, or can you provide more details on why Colt's foot should not be used internally?
No, I mean, pretty much on the data from FDA. So there's links in their data that goes back to the original recall. And that was what they said, pretty much verbatim, is this ingredient is not to be used internally.
Another question is regarding voluntary recalls. If a recall is voluntary, why does the company need to advise FDA?
Well, that's regulatory technicalities, right? So pre-Fisma, all recalls were voluntary. But in reality, they really weren't, because FDA would come to you and say, you need to recall this product. We're going to issue a press release. You need to recall this product. And companies complied. They did the right thing. Post-Fisma, FDA got the regulatory authority to force companies to perform recalls, and they've had to execute that a couple of times. So the voluntary piece of it is a misnomer, right? So if I'm running quality for a company and I have a recall situation, I'm going to go through that mechanism, put my information in the RFR, all of these types of things, notify FDA, and then begin executing that recall. It doesn't really matter from the standpoint of mandatory or voluntary.
Okay, thank you. Grace, I noticed that you raised your hand. If you want to send your question in through the Q&A tab, that is our only way to take questions in the webinar, that or the chat. So next question is regarding recalls. Do companies have to notify FDA in every recall situation, even if they've only sold 7 products?
So inside of your company, you need to have these procedures written in advance and practiced. And the way I always set these up is I divide it into 2 areas. The first is a crisis management team that evaluates a potential recall situation. So let's say that a consumer writes the company and says, I ate your product and it made me sick. That would activate that crisis management evaluation team. And you would begin gathering data, looking at the production information from the plant. Are there any other issues linked to this potential within the company? talking with your food safety lawyers, your external lawyers, right? Hint, hint from before, and figuring out within your company whether you have a situation that warrants a recall. And you may not, right? It could be that the data shows that you don't have an issue. A lot of times when people think something made them ill, they tie that attribute to the last thing that was eaten. And in a lot of situations, you need incubation time and these types of things. It depends upon the dosage and all these type of parameters. So there's a decision-making process that needs to be gone through. And then the company decides if they have a recall or not. So there's a whole mechanism associated with that. And if in your example, there were 7 products that had allergen mislabeling, you may have a recall, right? So part of this, and again, is the classification with FDA, which is why this data is so important, is then you begin explaining the situation with FDA and working with them and say, yep, we have 7 products. They're in the marketplace. We have a mislabeled allergen. We've been able to track them down. They're in this warehouse in another state, right? Because FDA has jurisdiction, interstate commerce. And they, who knows, right? This is FDA's call, but they need the data from you to reach the conclusion that they need to reach.
Great, thank you. Next question is regarding environmental monitoring. Will testing for Listeria be equal to testing for Listeria mono? Will FDA consider them to be the same?
So it's a bigger category. And so part of this is really and this is a whole another topic, right? So I'll try and hit this quickly. In the latest FDA operational inspections manual, they have a section in chapter 4 where they outline their environmental procedures. When FDA is going in and sampling in your facility, right, these swabathons that we hear about and things like this, they are sampling for Listeria monocytogenes. The other one that they're focusing on is Salmonella species, but specifically they're looking for L mono, and they're looking on zone 1 and zone 2, right? Zone 1, food contact, zone 2, adjacent to food contact. You as a company, right, and this is just my opinion, right? I don't know the details of this question or anything else, right? This is just speaking in generalities, is you should be looking at that very, very closely. And should we be mirroring the activities of FDA? And this is where food lawyers can help you with this decision too.
Let's see. The next question is regarding warning letters and labeling. And the person's wondering if there is a place that he can find warning levels for food labels.
Well, they're going to be 1, 2, 3, right? So they're going to fall under those categories like we talked about. So it's going to depend upon the different data and the different criteria. But most of these labeling issues that we're seeing here associated with recalls and things of this nature are allergen related. So for example, let's say that you have, you're using a milk product, casein, in your product, and you didn't label it on the label with the common name designation milk to let people know that it's in there. And you have a bunch of products in the marketplace, right? It's probably going to be a class 1 recall. And that's a label recall for a mislabeled product in an allergen.
Are dietary supplement products subject to being reported in the RFR?
I am not an expert on dietary supplements, so I don't want to necessarily give an answer on that, but I don't think dietary supplements go into the reportable food registry, but that's just my guess. So I would suggest looking at that a little more.
Okay, and I'll also, we do have, of course, a dietary supplement team, so I'll get the answer to that question and we can include that in our follow-up information. I also was just thinking regarding your mention earlier of swabathons and FDA environmental matches. We had a webinar over a year ago, I think. It will be on our on-demand webinars page on the EAS website. And the presenter discussed both swabathons, how to do it, and also environmental matches. So for those who are interested in that subject, that might be a good one to tune into.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, Amy.
Let's see. What is the predominant reason for analysis that resulted in chemical recalls? Was it for cause or survey?
Oh. So I think that was kind of a combination, right? So in some situations they tested and they found them. In other situations, I think maybe the company tested and found it, right? It was kind of a mixed bag. So on the slides of what I got is if I saw clear trends associated with data, I would kind of call that out. I didn't see a clear trend on that. It was kind of all over the place.
Then we had a question regarding the chicken cutlets and why was it included in an FDA recall when if it's over 2% meat, it belongs to USDA?
Good question. I don't know.
Okay, any other questions? Let's see, there's a clarification question on Listeria mentioned in your charts. Is it referring to Listeria? It's referring to Listeria mono, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. If you find a product is no longer, if you find your product has an ingredient that is no longer grass, should you initiate a recall?
That's a really specific question that I don't have an answer to, right? This is where food law comes into play, right? So you have an ingredient that's in a product that is fit for human consumption, and now they have said it's no longer fit for human consumption.
That's my understanding of the question.
Yeah, if that's the case, then yeah, you probably got to pull it off the market. But again, right, this is going back and forth with FDA on these type of things.
Right. And we have of course, EAS also has a grass team, so I can see if I can get a little more information on that for you. But of course, Brian is correct. Any legal questions would certainly be more appropriate for an attorney. And then one other question on the slides, will they be available later? Yes. Due to the size of them, we were not able to email them. So we will post them on the website when we were able to post the presentation. I don't see any other questions coming in. So let me just do a quick scan again. I think we've addressed everything. So Brian, thank you very much for a great presentation. Thanks for everyone in the audience for joining us today. And of course, any questions that you have, assistance you need, EAS will be glad to help. I'll just mention our upcoming webinars that we have June 9th. We have one called Distilling Fisma. It's on alcohol beverages and FDA. FDA regulates certain alcohol beverages, including wine, hard ciders under 7% alcohol by volume, beer made without malted barley or hops, hard seltzers made from fermented sugar, and kombucha. So if that's any of those are products that you make, of course, that would be a good one to tune into. July 15th, we have a deeper dive into Fsvp specifically, and both of those webinars are free for everyone to tune into. And of course, you're welcome as well to view any of our on-demand webinars that are available on the website. So thanks very much for joining us. Oops, let me just make sure I've got another, I might have another question over here. Nope, that's it. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Brian, again, and then have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.